By the time night settled fully over ancient Rome, certainty was already fading. The streets did not become dangerous all at once, nor did fear arrive suddenly. Instead, darkness brought a gradual narrowing of life, a quiet shrinking of movement, sound, and expectation. Lamps replaced the sun, doors closed earlier, voices softened, and with that slow dimming came customs that were never meant to be spoken of loudly, especially not in daylight. Welcome to Sleepy Historian, a place for boring history for sleep, and calm bedtime storytelling. Tonight's story is not one of drama or shock, but of routine endurance, of how ordinary people lived through the hours when sight weakened, energy faded, and belief quietly took over where certainty ended. In modern life, night often feels optional. Lights remain steady. Time blurs. Sleep can be delayed without consequence. But for the Romans, night was a boundary. It divided what could be seen from what could only be felt or imagined. And within that boundary, people adapted gently, carefully, and repeatedly, generation after generation. Rome did not sleep all at once. The city eased itself into darkness. Market stalls packed away their goods. Workshops fell silent. Public baths closed their doors. As the last warmth of the day left stone walls, families retreated indoors, knowing that night demanded a different pace. Not panic, just restraint. This is where our story begins. Not in forbidden temples or whispered conspiracies, but in the ordinary transition from evening to night. Because the rituals Rome tried to hide were not always secret in the way we imagine. Many were hidden simply because they belonged to darkness, and darkness was never meant to be observed too closely. For the people of Rome, survival at night was not heroic. It was patient. You would not rush through the hours. You would conserve warmth, conserve movement, conserve thought. Fatigue was accepted as part of the cycle. The mind softened as the body slowed, and belief stepped in to explain what daylight could not. This story follows that gradual softening. As lamps flickered and shadows stretched, Romans relied on patterns more than plans. Night was not a time to experiment. It was a time to repeat what had always worked. The same prayers, the same gestures, the same quiet acknowledgments of forces beyond control. These were not acts of rebellion against the state, but acts of comfort against uncertainty. The Roman world was deeply structured in daylight. Laws were written, roads were measured, time was tracked. But at night, structure loosened. Authority still existed, but did not reach every corner. The senses dulled. Sounds carried differently. A distant footstep could seem closer than it was. A dream could feel heavier than waking thought. And so, rituals formed, not to summon danger, but to soothe it. Some were officially approved. Many were tolerated. Others were discouraged, not because they were violent or extreme, but because they happened beyond easy supervision. The Roman state preferred clarity. Night did not offer that, and anything done consistently in darkness eventually attracted suspicion. Still, people continued. In homes across the city, small routines repeated themselves night after night. Lamps were placed carefully to avoid fire. Food was covered. Water was rationed. Bodies settled into stiffness as stone floors released the day's heat. You would feel the cold first in your feet, then slowly in your hands. Breath became shallower. Thoughts drifted more easily. This was not fear. It was awareness. Romans did not imagine night as an enemy. They saw it as a separate condition of life, one that required respect. Children were taught not to wander. Adults learned when to speak and when to remain silent. The night was listened to more than watched. Belief fit naturally into this environment. When vision weakened, meaning filled the gap. Dreams mattered. Small sound mattered. Patterns mattered. And so did rituals that acknowledged the unseen without inviting it closer. The forbidden rituals of Roman nights were often forbidden simply because they could not be easily explained. They were quiet, personal, repetitive, passed down within households rather than announced publicly. They left no monuments, no inscriptions, only habits. In a culture that valued order, night represented the absence of proof. and where proof faded, tradition took over. Throughout this story, survival will never be shouted. It will be implied, in the way people conserved energy, protected warmth, and limited risk. Endurance was not dramatic. It was habitual. Romans endured the night by accepting its limits, not by challenging them. You would feel your body slow as evening deepened. Muscles that worked all day grew reluctant. The mind lost its sharp edges. Decisions became simpler. Rest was not indulgence. It was necessity. And within that necessary rest lived rituals that Rome preferred not to spotlight. Some addressed restless spirits. Others focused on dreams. Some were gestures so small they barely registered. A whispered phrase, a coin placed just so, a lamp left burning longer than required. None were meant to be witnessed. All were meant to be repeated. Over the course of this calm journey, we will move gently through Roman nights, from the moment lamps are lit, through the deepest hours when time feels suspended, and finally toward the soft return of morning. We will observe without judgment. We will describe without sensationalism. And we will let repetition do what is always done best: settle the mind. This is not a story meant to keep you awake. It is meant to accompany rest. If at any point your thoughts drift, that is part of the experience. Romans understood drifting well. They lived with it nightly, and they trusted that morning would return without effort. So allow your attention to soften. Let the pace slow. There is nothing here that requires urgency. Tonight, we step quietly into the Roman night, not to uncover secrets, but to understand why some things were never meant to be seen in full light. Sleep comes later. For now, we begin with evening. By the first full hour after sunset, daylight was no longer something you could rely on. What remained was memory, of warmth, of color, of movement, and the careful work of replacing it with something smaller and less certain. In Roman cities, night did not arrive with finality. It crept in gradually, slipping between buildings and settling into courtyards long before the sky fully darkened. The last tasks of the day were never rushed. There was an understanding, shared quietly across households, that haste after dusk led to mistakes. Inside homes, lamps were lit with deliberate care. Oil was valuable, wicks were trimmed low. A flame too strong invited smoke, soot, and the ever-present risk of fire. A flame too weak left corners in shadow, and shadows were rarely welcomed. This was the first ritual of the Roman night, controlled light. Not ceremony, not prayer, just restraint. You would feel the change in your body as the light dimmed. I strained slightly. The sharpness of thought softened. Tasks that require precision were already finished. What remained were movements learned so well they no longer demanded attention. Outside, the sounds of the city thinned. Wheels rattled less often. Voices echoed more clearly between stone walls. Footsteps carried farther than they should have. Even familiar streets felt altered, as if they had shifted while no one was watching. Romans noticed this change early in life. Children were taught that night distorted distance and intention. A harmless noise could feel urgent. A familiar silhouette could appear unfamiliar. This was not superstition, it was observation. As darkness deepened, households transitioned inward. Doors were barred not from fear, but from habit. The night did not invite visitors. Anyone arriving late would already be suspect, if only because they disrupted the expected rhythm. Even meals changed character. Evening food was simpler, warmer, easier to digest. Heavy eating before sleep was discouraged, not by doctors alone, but by experience. The body did not work as efficiently at night. Fatigue made digestion sluggish. Restlessness followed indulgence. These patterns were repeated quietly across the city, forming an unspoken agreement between strangers who would never meet. At this hour, certain behaviors were discouraged without needing to be named. Sweeping after dark, for example, was avoided in many homes. Not because it angered spirits, but because it risked losing small objects, coins, needles, fragments of food, things difficult to recover once they vanished into shadow. This practical caution slowly acquired meaning. Over time, people spoke less of losing objects and more of losing luck. The behavior remained the same. The explanation softened. Roman religion often worked this way. Routine first, meaning later. As lamps settled into their steady glow, families gathered closer. Not for conversation, necessarily, but for shared presence. Silence was not uncomfortable. It was efficient. Talking required energy. Energy was preserved. You would notice stiffness settling into your joints as the warmth left the floor. Stone absorbed heat slowly and released it reluctantly. Sitting too long without shifting brought numbness. People adjusted positions frequently, learning to listen to their bodies in small ways. This was another quiet ritual, attention to discomfort before it became pain. In wealthier homes, slaves tended lamps and shutters, moving softly, trained to minimize disturbance. In poorer dwellings, every movement was shared. Privacy shrank at night. The walls did not grow thicker. The rooms did not grow larger. People adapted by accepting closeness. At this early stage of night, belief hovered gently at the edges of routine. Protective gestures were subtle. A hand brushed briefly against a doorway charm. A short phrase murmured, not loudly enough to be heard, but not silently either. Words spoken just for the speaker. These gestures were not dramatic. They did not summon gods. They acknowledged uncertainty. Romans understood that daylight belonged to authority, law, order, visibility. Night belonged to endurance. It was not ruled so much as navigated. As hours passed, the city's energy compressed inward. Taverns remained open longer, but even there behavior changed. Voices lowered. Disputes were discouraged. A broken bench or overturned cup after dark was more dangerous than it seemed. Injuries healed slower in the cold. Help arrived later. For most people, night was not the time to assert oneself. It was the time to reduce exposure. Inside homes, children were settled early. Sleep was not forced, but encouraged through familiarity. The same blanket, the same corner, the same lullaby repeated without variation. Novelty had no place here. You would feel your breathing slow naturally, not because you were instructed to relax, but because the environment no longer demanded alertness. Muscles released tension gradually. The mind followed. This was when certain household customs quietly diverged from public religion. Official prayers were structured and communal. Night gestures were personal and adaptable. They belonged to families, not temples. A lamp might be left burning longer than necessary, not for light, but for reassurance. A small offering of bread might be placed near the hearth, not announced, not explained. These actions were rarely taught explicitly. Children absorbed them by watching. Over generations, such habits accumulated weight. When questioned later by authorities or scholars, people struggled to explain them clearly. They were not commandments. They were comfort. And comfort, when repeated long enough, becomes tradition. As the early hours of night settled in, the Roman city entered a phase of suspension. Work was finished. Sleep had not yet fully arrived. This in-between space was where many of the so-called forbidden practices lived, not because they defied Rome, but because they existed outside its interest. They did not disrupt order. They simply did not contribute to it. You would sense this pause in yourself, thoughts wandering without urgency, awareness narrowing to what was immediately present, the lamp, the floor, the weight of your body resting. This was the threshold. Beyond it lay deeper night, where fatigue thickened and belief grew quieter but stronger. For now, the lamps held steady. The city breathed evenly, and nothing more was required. By the second portion of the night, silence no longer felt empty. It felt occupied. Every sound lingered longer than it had during the day, as though darkness itself slowed the air and refused to let noise pass through unnoticed. Roman towns never truly slept, but they did thin out. The constant layering of daytime noise, carts, vendors, tools, argument, fell away one strand at a time. What remained was a quieter weave, where even the smallest disturbance could be identified, located, and judged. You would notice this change without trying. A cough from a neighboring room carried clearly through the walls. Footsteps outside no longer blended into a crowd. They arrived alone, counted unconsciously, then faded. Dogs barked less often, but when they did, the sound stretched unervingly far. This heightened clarity was not comforting. It demanded attention at a time when the body preferred rest. Romans learned early that night sharpened awareness while dulling strength. The mind stayed alert longer than the muscles could support. This imbalance shaped behavior more effectively than any law. Inside homes, people moved less, not because they feared being heard, but because every movement felt larger than intended. A dropped cup would sound like a deliberate signal. A shifting bench might wake someone already hovering between sleep and awareness. This sensitivity encouraged stillness. You would feel it in your posture. Movements became economical. Gestures shortened. Tasks were completed in fewer steps. Even breathing softened, not intentionally, but because the body mirrored the quiet around it. Outside, the city rearranged itself through sound. You could tell which streets remained active by listening alone. A distant laugh revealed a tavern still open. The scrape of metal against stone suggested a guard changing position. Somewhere, water continued to move through channels unseen, marking time more steadily than voices. Romans did not consider night sounds meaningless. They categorized them instinctively. Expected sounds were ignored. Unexpected ones were noted, but not immediately confronted. Investigation after dark carried risk. Better to listen longer, gather certainty, then decide. This habit, waiting before reacting, became one of the most important survival skills of urban nightlife. Within this acoustic clarity, certain practices emerged quietly. People avoided calling names after dark unless necessary. Names carried identity. Identity invited attention. A vague sound was safer than a specific one. Messages, when exchanged, were brief. Not coded, not formalized, but familiar. 3 soft taps instead of 1 loud strike. Pauses between sounds to signal recognition. You would sense fatigue settling deeper now. The warmth from earlier lamps had faded. Muscles stiffened if left unmoved. To adjust position required effort, and effort produced sound. Many chose discomfort over disruption. Sleep approached unevenly. Some drifted easily. Others hovered in a half-waking state, alert to every shift in the building. Romans understood that rest did not always mean sleep. Lying still with eyes closed was considered sufficient on many nights. This acceptance reduced frustration. Fighting wakefulness was tiring. Allowing it was not. Belief slipped into this quiet space almost unnoticed. Certain sounds were said to attract misfortune, not because they summoned it, but because they broke the balance of night. Whistling indoors after dark, for example, was discouraged. The explanation varied. Some said it unsettled household spirits. Others simply said it invited trouble. The behavior remained consistent. The reasoning adapted to the listener. In communal buildings, these rules grew stricter. In shared sleeping quarters, one person's rest depended on another's restraint. Experienced laborers learned to time coughs, adjust bedding slowly, and endure discomfort rather than disturb the group. You would feel a mild tension in your jaw, your shoulders, the effort of remaining quiet while tired. Over time, this tension became familiar, even reassuring. It meant you were participating in the collective endurance of night. Street activity shifted toward necessity rather than commerce. Messengers moved carefully. Guards favored stillness over patrol. Thieves relied more on listening than movement. Everyone adapted to the same environment, even if their goals differed. Romans recognized that darkness equalized people in subtle ways. Status mattered less when visibility failed. Wealth did not sharpen hearing. Authority did not prevent fatigue. This realization made night a space of quiet humility. Inside temples and shrines, activity slowed but did not cease. Lamps were kept burning, not continuously tended, but checked often enough to prevent failure. The steady flame represented continuity, not protection. It reminded watchers that time moved forward even when the city rested. You would feel your thoughts begin to loosen now. Memories surfaced without urgency. Small worries replayed themselves, then dissolved. The mind drifted, anchored lightly to the sound around it. This drifting state was not fully trusted. Romans believed the boundary between waking and sleep left people suggestible. Decisions made in this state were often delayed until morning. Promises were avoided. Oaths postponed. Night was not the time for permanence. In private homes, quiet gestures continued. A blanket adjusted. A lamp wick nudged lower. A door checked once more. Not locked again, just confirmed. These actions repeated nightly became less about security and more about reassurance. You would notice how the body responded to repetition. Heart rate slowed. Breathing deepened. Even discomfort became predictable and therefore manageable. Outside, the city held itself together through mutual restraint. No single authority enforced silence. It emerged naturally, shaped by shared experience. This was the second layer of Roman night. Not darkness itself, but attention. Attention to sound. Attention to movement. Attention to the limits of endurance. And within that attention, certain quiet rituals took root. Not spoken of openly. Not recorded formally. Passed instead through imitation and habit. As this phase of night settled fully, the city prepared for its deepest hours, when even listening became tiring and vigilance softened into something closer to surrender. For now, sound still guided you, still anchored you, still reminded you that you were not alone in the dark. By the later hours of the night, darkness no longer felt like an absence of light. It felt like something that had arrived, settled, and taken its place among the living. Romans did not describe this change dramatically. They did not need to. It was understood through sensation rather than language. The air felt heavier, even indoors. Corners of rooms seemed deeper than before. Shadows no longer shifted with passing movement. They stayed fixed as though rooted. You would notice this most clearly when you stopped moving. Earlier, stillness had been a choice, an effort made to preserve quiet. Now it became the default state. The body resisted motion. Muscles cooled. Joints stiffened gently, not painfully, but enough to discourage unnecessary movement. This was the hour when many Romans believed the day had fully released its hold. Daily roles softened. A laborer was no longer defined by his tools. A matron no longer directed servants. Even authority figures receded into anonymity. At night, identities blurred, replaced by shared vulnerability. This was not fear. It was recognition. The city itself seemed to breathe differently. Fires burned lower. Lamps were adjusted again, not to extinguish them, but to acknowledge that they would not be watched constantly. Light became something intermittent, trusted to persist without supervision. In this dimness, imagination grew quieter rather than louder. Contrary to later stereotypes, Romans did not typically fill the night with elaborate terror. Instead, they approached it with cautious respect. Darkness was thought to amplify intention. Actions taken now, even small ones, were believed to linger longer in consequence. A harsh word spoken at night carried more weight. A promise made felt heavier. This belief encouraged restraint more effectively than fear ever could. You would feel this restraint internally. Thoughts slowed, but they also deepened. Ideas circled rather than raced. The mind drifted toward patterns, repetitions of days, seasons, habits. Sleep, if it came, did so unevenly. Many experienced segmented rest. A first sleep, then waking, then a second. This waking period was not considered abnormal. It was accepted as part of the body's rhythm. During this interval, people lay still and thought, or listened, or whispered softly to those beside them. Some used this time for quiet acts that daylight did not allow. Prayers spoken now were shorter, more personal. Not formal invocations, but simple acknowledgments, gratitude for warmth, for survival, for another day completed. These were not rituals enforced by temples. They emerged naturally from fatigue. You would feel your breathing synchronize with the room, with other sleepers, with the distant rhythm of the city. Outside, certain figures still moved. Not many, but enough to remind you the world had not stopped. Watchmen paused more often than they walked. Messengers chose the edges of streets. Animals scavenged cautiously, avoiding open spaces. Romans understood that darkness redistributed risk rather than increasing it. The same dangers existed as during the day, but their shape changed. Visibility decreased. Sound sharpened. Decision-making slowed. This shift encouraged patience. Inside households, this was the hour when boundaries softened. Children might stir and be soothed without reprimand. Elderly family members were checked on quietly. Even disagreements paused, not resolved but set aside. Night demanded postponement. You would sense mental fatigue now. Concentration dulled. Thoughts repeated themselves without urgency. The body began to seek warmth more insistently, curling inward, drawing limbs closer. Blankets were adjusted again, not to improve comfort significantly, but to signal readiness for deeper rest. Belief systems slipped into this space subtly. Certain times of night were considered more permeable, not to danger exactly, but to influence. Dreams from these hours were thought more meaningful. Waking thoughts less reliable. This led to a quiet discipline. Observe but do not act. If an idea arose now, it was noted mentally, then left untouched until morning. If anxiety surfaced, it was acknowledged, then allowed to fade without resolution. Romans valued this restraint. It protected them from exhaustion and from unnecessary conflict. In communal settings, this discipline extended outward. Those awake longer learned to measure their presence carefully. A shift of weight was delayed. A cough suppressed. Consideration replaced impulse. You would feel this consideration physically. A slight tension held, then gradually released as sleep finally deepened. The night reached its most settled phase here. Not silent, but balanced. Not empty, but contained. This was the point when darkness was no longer monitored. It was accepted. Within this acceptance, more private customs existed. Some families believed ancestors passed nearby at this hour. Not visibly, not interactively, but as a reminder of continuity. Others believed nothing at all, yet followed the same behaviors. Habit, not belief, shaped survival. The city rested unevenly, but intentionally. Every person endured the same limitations: cold, fatigue, uncertainty. And every person adapted in small, practiced ways. You would feel the edges of sleep soften now. Thoughts lost structure. Sensations blurred. The boundary between listening and dreaming thinned. This was not surrender. It was trust. Trust that the night, once respected, would pass. As this part of the night settled fully, the city moved closer to its deepest hours, when ritual, fatigue, and belief intertwined most quietly, and endurance became less conscious, more instinctive. That threshold had been crossed. By the time the night reached its middle hours, time itself felt less defined, as though the usual divisions of the day had loosened their hold. Romans did not think of these hours as empty. They understood them as belonging to neither day nor morning, a shared margin where normal expectations rested. The body sensed this before the mind named it. Breathing slowed. Limbs grew heavier. Even wakefulness changed character, becoming softer, less alert. You would feel this change most clearly if you woke during it. There was no urgency in the waking, no instinct to rise. The mind surfaced gently, aware of surroundings without fully engaging them. The room appeared familiar but distant, as if seen through memory rather than sight. This was the hour when many Romans believed restraint mattered most. During daylight, action was encouraged. At night's beginning, caution was exercised. But here, in these hours, stillness became a form of wisdom. Movement was delayed not from fear, but from understanding how little could be gained by action now. Houses reflected this philosophy. Doors remained barred, not newly secured. Fires were not fed, only maintained. Lamps were not repositioned unless absolutely necessary. Small sounds carried farther. A shift of straw under a mattress echoed softly. A distant footstep outside sounded closer than it was. Rather than reacting, people learned to listen until certainty emerged. You would notice how the body adapted. Muscles remained slightly tense, even in rest, ready but unprovoked. The cold seeped inward more insistently now, not sharply, but persistently. Blankets that had felt adequate earlier now seemed thinner. This was when people drew closer together in sleep. Children instinctively shifted toward warmth. Adults angled their bodies inward. Even animals curled tighter, reducing exposed surface. Warmth became communal rather than individual. In Roman thought, this hour carried a peculiar neutrality. It was not cursed nor sacred, but unsettled. Actions taken now were thought to lack clarity. Decisions made could feel distorted by fatigue. Because of this, important matters were deliberately postponed. Disputes paused. Planning ceased. Even worry was softened by the understanding that resolution belonged to morning. You would feel this internally as thoughts looped without progressing. Concerns repeated themselves gently, losing their sharp edges. The mind rehearsed familiar patterns, then released them. In some homes, this was when quiet routines occurred. Not rituals announced or enforced, but habits passed down unconsciously. A cup of water left near the bed. A whispered reassurance offered to a restless sleeper. A brief touch to confirm presence. These acts were not ceremonial. They were practical expressions of endurance. Outside, the city continued its subdued rhythm. Watch rotations changed with minimal movement. Dogs shifted positions without barking. Even those awake longer than others adopted slower patterns, conserving energy. Romans believed energy was a finite resource, not to be wasted when return was uncertain. This belief shaped behavior deeply. The night was not something to be conquered, but endured gently. Those who resisted it too forcefully were believed to suffer for it, not spiritually, but physically. Fatigue, they understood, accumulated quietly. You would feel it now behind the eyes, dull and persistent. Concentration faded. Listening required effort. Even imagination slowed, favoring repetition over invention. This was when dreams sometimes began before sleep fully arrived. Images drifted across awareness without narrative. Familiar places appeared briefly, then dissolved. Faces emerged without context. Romans did not try to control this state. They allowed it to pass over them, trusting that rest would follow. In shared spaces, boundaries softened further. Privacy existed, but without vigilance. Trust replaced supervision. People depended on routine rather than awareness to remain safe. This trust extended to beliefs about unseen forces. While certain hours were associated with spiritual presence, this time was thought to be quiet rather than active. The world, seen and unseen, was assumed to be resting together. You would feel this assumption as a lowering of mental defenses. The day's vigilance dissolved. Even fear, if it arose, lacked momentum. The night pressed on, steady and unremarkable. As the hours advanced, the body surrendered more fully to stillness. Breathing deepened. Muscles released their tension gradually. Thought gave way to sensation, then to nothing at all. This was not the dramatic descent into sleep imagined in later stories. It was a gentle fading, uneven and patient. Those who remained awake longest understood they were borrowing time for morning. They rested without sleeping, conserving strength, eyes closed but ears open. And those who slept did so knowing that waking again before dawn was not a failure of rest, but part of its design. In this way, the middle hours of the night belonged to endurance rather than experience. They asked nothing. They offered little. And in accepting them without resistance, Romans preserved themselves for what came next. The deeper hours, when quiet practices turned inward, and a line between habit and belief grew faint. By the deeper stretch of the night, certain habits emerged that were rarely spoken of in daylight. Not because they were forbidden, but because they did not belong to explanation. These were the hours when words felt heavier than actions. Romans understood that speech carried weight, especially when the world was quiet enough to receive it. During the day, voices dissolved into noise. At night, they lingered. Because of this, many people limited what they said, not out of fear, but out of care. You would notice this if you woke and heard a whisper. It was never rushed, never loud, often incomplete. A phrase might trail off before meaning fully formed, as if the speaker trusted the night to understand what words could not finish. These whispers were not confessions in the dramatic sense. They were acknowledgments, small admissions of fatigue, of uncertainty, of hope that had no urgency attached to it. This was also when certain quiet practices took place, not rituals with structure or public approval, but personal gestures repeated often enough to feel necessary. A finger traced briefly across a household symbol. A coin turned in the hand, not in prayer but in grounding. A breath held slightly longer before release. You would feel the body participate in these gestures before the mind labeled them. The movements were slow, deliberate, shaped by repetition rather than intention. These habits existed alongside official religion, not in opposition to it. Temples governed daylight. Night belonged to private endurance. Romans believed that unseen forces did not require constant attention. In fact, too much attention was considered disruptive. Respect was shown through restraint. This belief shaped the tone of night practices. There was no summoning, no demand, only acknowledgement of limits. You would sense these limits physically now. Muscles stiffened if held in one position too long. Fingers lost dexterity. The chills settled deeper, no longer sharp, but pervasive. In response, movements became economical. A blanket was adjusted once, then left. A position shifted carefully, then maintained. The mind mirrored this economy. Thoughts simplified. Instead of narratives, there were fragments. Sensations replaced explanations. During these hours, Romans often believed the boundary between thought and influence thinned slightly, not in a way that invited action, but in a way that encouraged caution. If an unsettling thought arose, it was not explored. It was noted, then set aside. Curiosity gave way to acceptance. You would feel this acceptance as a lowering of internal pressure. The urge to resolve faded. Problems became abstract, distant. In households with shared sleeping spaces, this was when awareness of others became most subtle. Breathing patterns aligned unconsciously. A restless sleeper was soothed by proximity rather than words. Touch, if it occurred, was brief and reassuring. A hand placed, then withdrawn. A shoulder brushed lightly. These gestures communicated presence without demand. Outside, those few still moving adopted similar restraint. Night workers, bakers, guards, messengers performed tasks methodically, without haste. Their movements were deliberate, conserving warmth and clarity. Romans understood that fatigue altered judgment. The night was not a time for improvisation. This extended to beliefs surrounding misfortune. Accidents that occurred at night were often attributed not to fate, but to exhaustion. Responsibility remained human. Because of this, people avoided unnecessary tasks. Repairs waited. Travel paused. Even writing was discouraged unless essential. Ink froze more easily at night. Hands cramped. Meaning suffered. Instead, endurance took precedence. The goal was not productivity, but preservation. You would feel preservation become instinctual now. Breathing deepened. Movement slowed further. The body signaled its needs plainly. Sleep, when it came, did so unevenly. Some drifted into it quickly. Others hovered at its edge, neither fully awake nor fully dreaming. Romans accepted this variability. They did not measure rest by duration, but by renewal. This acceptance shaped how they interpreted dreams during these hours. Dreams were not predictions. They were reflections of imbalance, of hunger, fatigue, unresolved thought. Because of this, dreams were rarely discussed in detail. Sharing them was believed to weaken their influence, stripping them of meaning. Silence protected equilibrium. You would sense silence now not as emptiness, but as a container. It held breath, thought, and sensation gently. The night advanced without ceremony. Time passed, but without markers. No bells rang. No announcements were made. Eventually, the body began preparing for the final stretch before dawn. Not consciously, but biologically. Breathing slowed further. Muscles relaxed incrementally. Awareness dimmed. This was the quietest boundary of all, the point where night's practices faded into pure rest. And within that fading, the Romans trusted something simple, that restraint, repeated nightly, was enough to carry them through uncertainty. They did not need to name these habits. They lived them. By the final hours before dawn, the night carried a weight that could be felt even through sleep. This was not a dramatic heaviness. It did not press sharply or demand attention. Instead, it settled gradually, like a deeper layer of stillness placed gently over the world. The body recognized this change instinctively, often before the mind did. You would feel it if you woke during these hours. The air seemed colder, though fires still burned and walls still held. The chill was not new. It was simply more complete, reaching places warmth had not yet touched. Fingers felt stiffer. Breathing required slightly more effort. Even blinking felt slower. Romans understood these hours as the most neutral of the night. They did not belong to rest, nor to preparation. They existed between endurance and renewal. Because of this, very little was expected of anyone during this time. Those who were awake did not speak unless necessary. Words felt intrusive now, breaking a balance that had taken hours to form. Even prayers, if offered, were often silent, internal acknowledgments rather than spoken appeals. You would sense thought change character here. Ideas no longer unfolded. They drifted briefly into awareness, then receded without resistance. Memory softened. The boundary between past and present blurred gently. This mental dulling was not feared. Romans recognized it as a sign that the body was conserving itself. Sharpness would return with light. Movement, when it occurred, was careful and minimal. Someone rising to tend a fire did so slowly, allowing joints to adjust before bearing weight. A shift in bedding was deliberate, as if the body negotiated each change rather than commanding it. You would feel this negotiation clearly. Muscles responded with hesitation. Balance required attention. Fatigue was not overwhelming, but constant. In shared spaces, awareness of others became even more abstract. Breathing patterns blended into a single rhythm. Individual presence dissolved into collective stillness. This was when many Romans believed the household was most unified, not through interaction, but through shared vulnerability. Outside, the city felt paused rather than asleep. The few lights that remained burned steadily, no longer adjusted. Watchmen leaned more often than they stood. Animals that scavenged earlier now rested, conserving energy. These hours carried no ambition. Even those who had remained awake through much of the night understood this was not a time to think ahead. Planning was deferred. Anticipation softened. You would feel anticipation fade within yourself. The future narrowed to the immediate warmth, breath, stillness. Beliefs surrounding this time were subtle. Some Romans thought this was when the world was least divided, when boundaries between spaces thinned, not to invite intrusion, but to allow balance. Because of this, actions were restrained further. No doors were opened unless required. No journeys begun. No confrontations pursued. The night asked only patience. You would feel patience take a physical form now. A willingness to remain still. An acceptance of discomfort without the urge to correct it immediately. Cold lingered, but it was familiar. Fatigue persisted, but it was expected. Even anxiety, if present, lacked urgency. This acceptance was not resignation. It was a learned response, shaped by generations who understood that resisting the night wasted energy better, saved for day. Romans did not romanticize these hours. They did not seek meaning in them. They endured them quietly. Sleep, if it came now, was deep but brief. Many woke again before dawn, not startled, but alert enough to sense change approaching. The body began preparing without instruction. Breathing shifted subtly. Muscles loosened just enough to allow movement later. Awareness sharpened slightly, though eyes remained closed. You would sense this sharpening as a faint readiness, not eagerness, but capacity. The sky outside remained dark, but it no longer felt infinite. Time resumed its shape gradually. The night began to thin, almost imperceptibly. This was when endurance gave way to transition. Romans trusted this transition. They did not hurry it. They allowed the night to complete itself fully before welcoming light. As these final hours passed, the quiet boundaries of night dissolved slowly. What had been restrained would soon expand again. What had been softened would regain clarity. And those who endured these hours without resistance found themselves better prepared. Not because they had acted, but because they had waited. The night released them gently. By the time the night reached its middle depth, the body no longer questioned why it was awake. This acceptance did not arrive suddenly. It formed slowly, shaped by hours of restrained movement and softened thought. What began as alertness had dulled into something steadier, a quiet endurance that required no explanation. You would feel this change most clearly in the body rather than the mind. Warmth, once concentrated in the chest and core, spread less evenly now. Hands rested cooler. Feet felt distant, as if they belonged to another space entirely. Even under blankets or cloaks, heat no longer moved quickly. Romans recognized this sensation as natural. They did not interpret it as danger, only as limitation. The body, they believed, conserved warmth where it mattered most. Breathing adjusted accordingly. Inhalations grew slightly shallower, slower, conserving effort. Exhalations lingered, releasing tension gradually rather than all at once. You would notice how stillness became easier than motion. Remaining in place felt efficient. Any movement, even small, carried a cost that the body calculated carefully. In shared sleeping spaces, this stillness spread quietly from person to person. One man settling into rest influenced another. The absence of sound reinforced itself. These hours were not silent because of rule or fear, but because noise felt unnecessary. Mentally, awareness narrowed. Thoughts did not disappear, but they lost urgency. Concerns that mattered earlier felt distant, almost theoretical. What remained was immediate sensation, the pressure of the ground beneath you, the weight of fabric, the rhythm of breath. Romans experienced this narrowing often enough to trust it. They understood that clarity would return later, and that resisting dullness served no purpose. Some households maintained a low flame through these hours, not to provide light, but to anchor the space. Fire offered reassurance without demanding attention. You would feel comfort simply knowing it burned. Outside, the city rested in layers. Upper rooms slept deeper, insulated from street air. Lower spaces felt the cold more sharply, but also carried the quiet of stone and earth. Watchmen continued their slow circuits, though fewer steps were taken now. Each movement was deliberate, conserving strength. They leaned more often, listened longer, spoke rarely. Fatigue did not arrive as collapse. It arrived as weight. You would feel it settle across the shoulders, into the neck behind the eyes. Not painful, not alarming, simply present. Romans described this as the body remembering the dark. It was a state familiar to farmers, soldiers, sailors, and laborers alike. The night taught restraint, and the body listened. Sleep, when it came, was uneven. Short stretches of rest were interrupted naturally, without distress. Waking felt neutral, neither pleasant nor unpleasant. You would open your eyes without urgency, take in the dimness, then close them again if nothing required attention. Dreams during this period were often shallow and fragmented. Images drifted through the mind without narrative. Sounds blended into sensation rather than meaning. This mental softness was valued. It reduced fear, dulled impatience, and prepared the mind for the slow return of structure. In some Roman traditions, this was the safest time of night, not because nothing happened, but because little was attempted. Risk declined when expectation declined. People trusted routine here. They trusted that fires would continue burning, walls would hold, and dawn would arrive when ready. You would feel trust manifest physically. Muscles loosened slightly, jaw unclenched, breath deepened again. The body, having learned the night's rhythm, stopped resisting it. cold persisted, but it no longer felt intrusive. Fatigue remained, but it stabilized rather than worsened. Discomfort became predictable, and predictability brought calm. Romans believed this was the night's quiet lesson, that endurance did not require strength, only patience. As these hours passed, the body entered a steady state. Neither fully resting nor fully alert, it hovered between. You would feel suspended there, supported by habit and environment. Nothing asked more of you. And so the night continued, not as an obstacle, but as a condition, one the body had learned to inhabit. By the second watch of night, subtle obligations became more pressing, even as energy ebbed. You would notice how small movements accumulated weight. Reaching for a vessel of water across a dimly lit room required more thought than it did hours before. Hands stiffened slightly. Joints reminded you of their limits. Each action, no matter how ordinary, bore the quiet cost of fatigue. Within Roman households, the night brought whispered responsibilities. Servants moved softly along stone floors, carrying supplies for those who slept above or preparing small embers to warm rooms. Food that would be needed at first light was arranged carefully, not hurriedly. Nothing demanded urgency. Everything was measured and deliberate. The atmosphere itself contributed to endurance. The soft glow of oil lamps, muted by clay sconces, cast long shadows across walls. Curtains of woven fibers allowed the chill to linger just enough to remind the body to conserve energy, but not so harshly as to disturb calm. Every visual cue reinforced careful movement. You would sense the slow rhythm of the household, the creak of a floorboard beneath careful steps, the distant murmur of guards, and the whisper of fabric as it was adjusted around sleeping forms. These are the markers of time's passage, steady and unremarkable, yet intimately shaping behavior. Mentally, awareness narrowed further. Decision-making shifted from broad strategies to immediate considerations. When to move, when to pause, how to adjust posture to retain warmth. Romans often referred to this as thinking with the body, where cognition and sensation merged. The mind became a subtle instrument of endurance, guided by environmental cues. Sustaining this awareness required quiet cooperation. Household members, both free and enslaved, understood the necessity of measured noise. One careless step or sudden exhalation could ripple through sleeping chambers, disturbing the fragile calm. In this way, discipline was not enforced violently but cultivated gently through habit. You would feel a heightened sensitivity to temperature shifts. The warmth near embers or lanterns became a small comfort. The cooler corners of the room a signal to remain still. Heat was not abundant, yet it was enough when treated with patience. Fatigue amplified these contrasts, making careful placement of blankets or proximity to lamps a minor but essential strategy. Even in the absence of overt tasks, Romans acknowledged the slow accumulation of strain. Muscles grew taut from prolonged stillness, but gentle stretching or subtle shifts in posture alleviated discomfort without drawing attention. The body adapted quietly, learning to balance tension and relaxation simultaneously. In some households, the night also required minimal vigilance. Guards or watchmen moved at deliberate intervals, checking doors or observing streets beyond walls. Their footsteps, measured and predictable, provided both a sense of security and a gentle reminder of the structured world beyond private chambers. You would notice how the mind, dulled by fatigue, integrated these movements seamlessly. Attention was selective. Critical cues were recognized instinctively, while distractions were filtered out. This selective awareness allowed for calm survival, without strain or fear. Sleep remained irregular. Short bouts of rest alternated with wakefulness, punctuated by necessity rather than discomfort. Romans accepted this as natural. The night was not conquered but inhabited, and the body, along with the mind, adjusted accordingly. You might close your eyes and drift for a few minutes, then awaken softly to adjust a blanket or whisper instructions, always maintaining calm composure. In this environment, endurance was both quiet and shared. The cumulative effect of small movements, soft noises, and subtle adjustments created a rhythm, a nearly imperceptible pulse of activity. Those attuned to it moved in harmony, conserving strength while maintaining order. You would feel the mind settle into the rhythm. Thoughts slowed, senses sharpened in subtle ways, and muscles coiled only as much as needed. Fatigue, while present, was not a hindrance but a companion, guiding each action and pause with gentle insistence. By the final hours before the approaching dawn, the household seemed suspended in collective patience. Nothing happened suddenly. The world remained calm, and survival, quiet, enduring, and almost invisible, persisted not through action but through observation, adaptation, and gentle attentiveness. By the approach of first light, the night's quiet demands had evolved into a gentle anticipation. You would feel the stiffness of limbs, accumulated from hours of measured activity and constrained motion. Joints and shoulders protested slightly with each deliberate movement, yet the body had learned the rhythm of restraint. Even the act of standing or reaching for simple objects required subtle coordination, a soft negotiation between fatigue and necessity. In the household, the last hours before dawn were marked by minimal motion. The faintest sounds, the rustle of fabric, the soft creak of floorboards, or the whispered instruction from one servant to another, were amplified in the hushed interior. Observation and restraint had been perfected through the night, and the dawn brought with it a transition from quiet maintenance to purposeful preparation. You would notice the careful choreography of duties. Water vessels were replenished, embers gently stoked, and lamps extinguished or readjusted. The servants moved in a sequence almost invisible to the casual eye, each action deliberate yet light, conserving energy while completing essential tasks. Even a faint aroma of oil and warmed bread served as subtle markers of routine and endurance. Mentally, your awareness had shifted again. Early in the night, each movement demanded conscious thought. By dawn, tasks flowed with gentle instinct. Attention was divided between observing your own body's limits and anticipating the needs of those soon to awaken. This dual focus created a quiet mindfulness, a calm immersion that had been refined by hours of nocturnal labor. The slow approach of sunlight filtered through shutters and narrow windows, casting muted patterns on stone floors. Light, gentle and diffuse, illuminated the space without startling the senses. You would feel it brush against skin cooled by hours of inactivity, a soft awakening of muscles and awareness alike. Roman households observed a rhythm of preparedness. Meals were arranged, simple cleaning completed, and animals quietly fed. Each act, while minor, contributed to the overall endurance of the household. The servants understood that these small efforts ensured smooth transition into daytime activities, sustaining both the household's order and their own steady survival. You would feel the subtle interplay between fatigue and alertness. Eyes, previously heavy, now tracked movements with gentle attentiveness. Hands, once tense from long hours of holding vessels or adjusting bedding, relaxed just enough to allow precision without strain. This balance of effort and release defined a last watch before dawn. Outside, the world remained calm. Streets were largely empty, with only distant sounds of carts or the occasional passerby. The external quiet mirrored the interior stillness, reinforcing a sense of calm vigilance. You were aware of the broader environment, yet it did not intrude. It was a gentle backdrop to the household's own rhythm. In these hours, endurance was quiet but cumulative. The mind processed small anomalies. A slightly shifted blanket, the faint scent of smoke from a distant hearth, or the soft footfall of a colleague returning from a minor task. Each detail was cataloged effortlessly, informing the next set of minor actions without alarm or haste. You would feel a sense of subtle cohesion among the household. Though words were few, shared understanding connected each person to the others. This was endurance as social practice, an unspoken agreement to move with care, observe with patience, and act only as necessary. The night's fatigue had softened into a gentle attentiveness, shaping both movement and thought. By the time the first full rays of sunlight penetrated the room, the household had completed most nocturnal duties. The servants paused briefly, stretching muscles coiled by hours of measured labor. The body's tension eased, the mind's focus remained, and the quiet vigilance transitioned seamlessly into the rhythms of day. You would note the almost imperceptible satisfaction in this completion, a sense of having navigated the night's obligations, preserved energy, and maintained order without overt exertion. This quiet mastery, though unremarkable on the surface, defined the subtle survival strategies of those living within Roman households. Dawn arrived slowly, softly, and without fanfare. The fatigue of the night lingered, but it was now balanced by preparation, awareness, and the continuity of routine. Survival had not been dramatic, nor had it required extreme measures. It had been, instead, the result of patience, observation, and quiet endurance. By the first full light of dawn, the household settled into a rhythm of quiet labor that would carry through the morning. The day began not with noise or haste, but with measured attention. You would feel the lingering stiffness of limbs, each movement deliberate, each step a gentle negotiation between weariness and necessity. In the courtyard, the first acts of the day unfolded. Servants fetched water from cisterns, carefully balancing heavy jars on their shoulders, the cool morning air brushing against dampened skin. You would notice the subtle shift of muscles as you adjusted posture, a minor ache in the lower back from the night's long vigil, gradually giving way to gentle warmth as movement increased. Small details, once trivial, demanded renewed focus. The way a jar balanced, the slight tilt of a bucket, the careful placement of objects to avoid spillage. Inside, kitchens awoke with soft, almost imperceptible sounds. Pots were arranged, ashes brushed from hearths, and the faint aroma of early bread preparations mingled with the cool air. You would perceive the difference between fatigue and readiness. Hands once stiff, now moving with precise rhythm. Eyes alert to minor irregularities that might disrupt the morning's order. Every gesture, though small, contributed to the endurance of the household. The external environment mirrored this internal cadence. Birds began their morning song softly. A distant cart rattled over cobblestones, and the breeze carried subtle scents of salt and earth. You would feel the gentle awakening of senses dulled by night. Ears tuned to faint sounds, eyes tracing shifts of light across walls, nose catching the first warmth of the sun hitting stone. Each perception reinforced the household's slow, deliberate efficiency. Servants worked in tandem, their movements forming a quiet choreography. One tended the fire, another prepared the bread, while others arranged water or swept the floors. Conversation was minimal, whispers exchanged only when necessary, preserving calm focus. You would notice the social endurance embedded in this routine. Patience, attentiveness, and a shared understanding that efficiency, not haste, ensured the smooth function of daily life. Small crises arose, though they were subtle rather than dramatic. A jar might slip slightly from a ledge, a hearth ember need careful repositioning, or a basket of vegetables required careful adjustment. Each potential disruption was handled with gentle, deliberate attention rather than alarm. You would feel the gradual sharpening of coordination and alertness, the body and mind fully engaged in sustaining daily survival through minor, continuous efforts. By mid-morning, the household's activities had expanded beyond basic maintenance. Gardens were tended quietly, herbs for medicine gathered with careful hands, and animals fed in calm, predictable sequences. The soft warmth of the sun now pressed gently on shoulders and arms, relieving night-induced stiffness, yet also introducing subtle fatigue from the day's ongoing duties. You would feel this gentle tension, a reminder of the endurance inherent in routine work. Mentally, awareness shifted as well. The night's passive vigilance gave way to active but controlled engagement. observing, anticipating, and responding to minor needs became a quiet rhythm, a practice of subtle endurance. You would perceive the gradual development of expertise, the way repeated tasks required less conscious effort while retaining attention to detail. This balance of ease and alertness defined the quiet resilience of those who labored within Roman households. By late morning, the first visitors arrived: tradesmen, minor officials, or household acquaintances. The servants adjusted to these interactions with calm composure, gestures smooth and measured, voices soft and respectful. You would notice the interplay of social awareness and physical coordination, offering water, adjusting robes, or arranging seating with careful attention. These tasks required subtle endurance, blending social grace with practical execution. Through all these activities, the household remained a place of quiet survival. Endurance was not dramatic, but cumulative, achieved through repeated attention, gentle movement, and shared understanding. You would feel the faint warmth of satisfaction that comes from completing minor labor successfully, knowing that each act sustained both the household's function and your own steady continuation of daily life. As the sun climbed higher, shadows shortened, and the early morning chores concluded, the household prepared for the next segment of its day. Tasks would shift toward meals, cleaning, and preparation for midday activity, yet the quiet, deliberate rhythm remained unbroken. Each person, though slightly fatigued, maintained calm attentiveness, a subtle mastery of endurance that had been refined through countless repetitions. By the time the first significant light fell across courtyards and floors, you would feel the culmination of the night and early morning's work. Stiffness softened, attention focused, and the household ready to meet the day with gentle persistence rather than urgency. Survival had never been dramatic. It was measured, composed, and quietly continuous. By the late morning, the subtle labor of the household had shifted toward a steadier, more continuous rhythm. The initial stiffness of early movements had mostly faded, replaced by a low hum of physical activity, a gentle pulse that marked the passing hours. You would feel the warmth of the sun creeping across your skin, mingling with the mild fatigue of repeated bending, lifting, and carrying. The balance between exertion and rest was delicate, each action moderated by experience. In the garden, hands now moved with practiced efficiency. Herbs were cut with careful precision, roots gently shaken free of soil, and water drawn from the cistern to nourish tender plants. You would notice the subtle weight of sun-warmed soil under fingernails, the slight dampness clinging to wrists, and the quiet satisfaction of seeing rows of greenery thriving. Every small gesture contributed to the household's well-being, an unspoken contract of shared effort and responsibility. Inside the house, the kitchen now produced the midday meal. Fires were stoked carefully to maintain a consistent heat, pots and pans arranged so that multiple tasks could be accomplished simultaneously. You would perceive the faint aroma of cooked grains mingling with the sharper scent of herbs, a sensory reminder of both sustenance and routine. The servants coordinated without overt instruction, a silent choreography of motions honed through repetition. Social interaction within the household had also evolved. Minor errands, messages sent to nearby homes, deliveries of fresh goods, or visits from neighbors required both mental and physical attentiveness. You would feel the subtle mental shift. Anticipation, calculation, and timing blended into each step and gesture. Moving with measured care, each person accounted for both the tangible weight of objects and the intangible expectations of social etiquette. The midday rhythm also revealed the household's quiet hierarchy. Older, experienced servants oversaw tasks with calm authority, guiding younger helpers through subtle corrections and reminders. You would sense the endurance required not only to maintain physical tasks, but also to navigate social roles and responsibilities. Each correction was gentle, each instruction soft-spoken, contributing to an atmosphere of controlled calm rather than tension. Small challenges continued to arise. A misplaced jar, an unevenly balanced basket, or a dish needing extra attention required subtle adjustments. You would feel your own body respond to these demands. Fingers flexing carefully, feet shifting weight to maintain balance, eyes tracing patterns of movement with gentle focus. The day's rhythm was defined less by crisis than by steady engagement, a continuous series of minor adjustments and attentions. The sun climbed higher, casting longer shadows across the courtyards and floors. You would notice the gradual increase in warmth, the slight sheen of perspiration on skin, and the soft fatigue accumulating in muscles. Yet these sensations were balanced by a steady sense of purpose. Each task completed reinforced both the household survival and your personal endurance. Physical tiredness was countered by mental engagement, a harmony of body and mind sustained through habitual practice. In the storerooms and pantries, meticulous attention to inventory ensured that food and supplies would last. You would feel the careful weight of grain sacks, the resistance of wooden containers, and the subtle strain of repetitive lifting. The work was quiet but continuous, a gentle test of stamina and coordination rather than a dramatic trial. Each movement reinforced a pattern of diligence, a reminder that survival within this household depended on sustained, deliberate action. By mid-afternoon, the household had reached a steady plateau of activity. Meals had been prepared, herbs collected, and supplies organized. Conversations remained soft, coordinated with gestures and minimal speech, preserving calm efficiency. You would perceive the collective rhythm, bodies in motion, minds attentive, tasks interwoven into a seamless flow of endurance and care. Fatigue accumulated subtly, a gentle dulling of sensation that contrasted with the heightened awareness of early morning. You would feel the gradual transition between alertness and sustained effort, the soft rhythm of controlled breathing, and the steady pulse of movement. This was the essence of daily life, a quiet endurance, an unbroken chain of small actions, each contributing to the household's persistence. As the sun approached its zenith, shadows shortened and temperatures rose gently. The household prepared for a brief pause, a moment of rest before the afternoon's duties. You would notice the subtle shift in pace. Muscles loosened slightly, hands paused mid-motion, and minds reflected briefly on completed tasks. It was a quiet acknowledgement of the day's progress, a gentle interlude before the continuation of labor. By this point, you would feel the cumulative effect of the morning and early afternoon. Warmth balanced with mild fatigue, alertness softened by repetition, and a calm awareness of the household's interdependence. Survival was embedded not in dramatic heroism, but in measured, continuous engagement, a rhythm of work, observation, and quiet endurance that would carry through the day. By late afternoon, the household had transitioned from the steady midday rhythm into a slower, more deliberate pace. The sun's angle softened, and the warmth that had been pressing during earlier labor now settled into a gentle heat that lingered on the skin. You would feel the subtle fatigue of hours of quiet exertion, a gentle ache in the shoulders and lower back, balanced by the satisfaction of steady accomplishment. Every motion now carried a calm deliberation, the body moving in harmony with habitual routines. Inside the main hall, the preparation for evening meals unfolded. Fires were stoked to a moderate heat, and the aroma of roasted grains, simmered vegetables, and herbs filled the air. You would notice the subtle sensations of warmth radiating from hearths, the soft hum of conversation between servants, and the occasional creak of wooden beams under the weight of the day's activities. Each action was deliberate, measured, and unobtrusive, a testament to the household's quiet endurance. In the garden and courtyard, the final collection of herbs and water drew a soft rhythm of movement. You would feel the gentle strain in your hands as you lifted containers and handled soil, but also the calm satisfaction of observing each plant carefully nurtured throughout the day. The balance between exertion and observation deepened, and the interplay of sun, wind, and gentle moisture created a tactile awareness of the environment. Within the household, coordination continued to define the evening. Tasks such as tidying workspaces, storing utensils, and ensuring all perishable goods were secured required attention. but the urgency had softened. You would feel the shift in mental focus from constant anticipation and adjustment to methodical reflection on what had been accomplished. This was a subtle form of survival, maintaining order, preparing for the night, and attending to small but essential details. The senior servants, who had guided you through the day, now moved with a slower authority. Their gestures and instructions were calm and precise, shaping the actions of younger helpers with gentle correction. You would perceive the endurance required not only in physical labor, but also in the subtle management of social dynamics, a quiet coordination that maintained both efficiency and harmony. Each instruction reinforced patterns of care, responsibility, and observation, essential for sustaining life within this small, enclosed community. As evening deepened, shadows stretched long across the floors and courtyards. You would notice the interplay of light and darkness, the soft glow from fires contrasting with the dimming sunlight through open windows. This gentle shift carried with it a mental transition. Attention softened, muscles relaxed, and the body began to anticipate the slower pace of night. The cumulative exertion of the day was now paired with a gradual easing, a rhythm that invited reflection on both the physical and mental labors endured. Quiet observations continued throughout the household. You would feel the weight of repeated movements in your legs and arms, the soft dulling of alertness in your mind, and the warmth of the fading day pressing gently against your skin. The patterns of human endurance were evident in the rhythm of footsteps, the lifting of utensils, and the subtle shifts of posture that carried tasks forward without disturbance. There was a profound calm in this persistence, a reassurance that survival and comfort were achieved not through drama, but through steady attentiveness. Some tasks carried a subtle social dimension. Preparing for evening meals required coordination between kitchen staff, gardeners, and senior household members. You would notice the careful I used to ensure no missteps, the gentle reminder pass between hands, the nonverbal understanding that guided efficiency. Survival within the household relied as much on social attention as physical exertion, a quiet awareness that each person's diligence contributed to the collective well-being. By twilight, the household moved toward its final activities of the day. Fires were adjusted to provide gentle heat, containers were sealed, and paths through the rooms were cleared. You would feel the gradual transition of energy, muscles heavy but responsive, mind alert but calm, senses attuned to both the immediate surroundings and the subtle cues that maintained order. The body and mind moved in tandem, prepared for the final chapter of the day's labor. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the household settled into the early evening. You would notice the interplay of exhaustion and satisfaction, the warmth of communal effort, and the quiet endurance of a day fully engaged. The routine had offered not only sustenance, but a measured exercise of attention, strength, and patience. Here, in these final hours, the household demonstrated the gentle, cumulative power of deliberate human effort, a subtle form of resilience shaped by repetition, observation, and care. The evening drew to a close with minor preparations for nightfall. Windows were shuttered, fires brought to a safe glow, and the household's rhythm slowed to a soft murmur. You would feel the gentle weight of a day completed, fatigue tempered by accomplishment, alertness softened by routine, and the mind primed for the restful pause that awaited. Survival, once again, was a quiet, measured endurance, embedded in the unremarkable yet essential acts of daily life. As the narrative of the Roman night rituals settles in your mind, you might imagine yourself stepping back from the shadows of the past. The candlelight in small rooms has dimmed, the faint hum of distant streets has quieted, and a gentle calm has returned to the spaces once animated by daily labor and nocturnal observances. You would feel the subtle relief in your body as tension eases, your muscles softening from imagined hours of engagement, your mind drifting gently toward rest. Sleepy Historian reminds us that history is rarely about sudden shocks. It is about the slow accumulation of human endurance, the quiet negotiation with limits, and the subtle strategies that allowed communities to navigate daily life. In the case of these ancient Roman rituals, the mysteries and taboos are less about spectacle and more about structure, social cohesion, and careful attention to timing and place. Even in what might appear strange or secretive, there is a rhythm that sustained people, providing them with a sense of order and continuity. The physical environment of Roman towns, cobblestone streets, wooden stairways, stone courtyards, was in itself a teacher. You would notice the careful balance required in every step, the tactile awareness necessary to avoid missteps, and the constant, quiet observation of the people around you. The endurance required was subtle, maintaining composure, moving through space with deliberate attention, and sustaining the responsibilities expected by social hierarchy and ritual expectation. Each act, however small, contributed to survival, cohesion, and continuity. Within the homes and temples, servants and citizens alike managed fatigue and responsibility with gentle precision. You would feel the rhythm of their day in your imagination, the lift of a water jar, the careful arrangement of torches, the whisper of movement across polished floors. These seemingly mundane actions were fundamental to the security and comfort of all who shared the space. A reminder that human endurance is built on repeated, measured effort rather than dramatic intervention. As you reflect on these ancient practices, notice the interplay between light and shadow, labor and rest, observation and contemplation. The Roman night rituals, though once hidden or whispered about, were integrated into broader patterns of daily life, reinforcing social bonds and personal discipline. You would sense the mental endurance required, the ability to remain attentive without panic, to participate fully without overextension, and to balance curiosity with restraint. It is a quiet lesson in resilience, one that transcends centuries. The gradual tilt from activity to calm mirrors the natural day-night cycle. The routines you have observed unfold with gentle inevitability, preparation, participation, and reflection. The endurance of those long ago is felt not in the extraordinary, but in the ordinary, the measured steps, the careful placement of objects, the soft exchange of glances between participants. In this quiet, measured context, you can feel both their humanity and their ingenuity, their vulnerability and their care. You might also consider the social architecture that supported these rituals. Families, slaves, and citizens each had defined roles, and the success of even minor ceremonies depended on careful coordination. You would perceive the subtle negotiation required to maintain harmony, the attentiveness to timing, the muted cues exchanged between participants, and the patient observation of protocols. In these moments, the endurance of the human spirit is manifest in quiet, deliberate collaboration rather than in overt heroism. As you breathe slowly and settle into this reflection, imagine the world outside the Roman walls continuing in its own rhythms, streets dimly lit, wind stirring leaves, distant conversations fading in a soft night. The contrast between their daily vigilance and your present safety emphasizes the passage of time and the comfort of modern perspective. You would notice how the body responds. Shoulders loosen, eyelids feel heavy. The mind releases the tension of imagined engagement, and curiosity gently shifts toward rest. Finally, as you prepare to leave these ancient streets behind, consider the value of observation and calm endurance. The small, repeated acts of the Roman people, raising lamps, maintaining hearths, observing sacred patterns, provided stability in a world of otherwise unpredictable circumstance. You would feel gratitude for the modern ease you inhabit, where survival is largely assured and reflection can replace labor. The night rituals are now a lens through which to appreciate the quiet strength embedded in ordinary routines. Sleepy Historian closes this chapter by inviting you to rest fully, to allow the mind and body to drift peacefully. The endurance, patience, and subtle attentiveness you have witnessed are quietly inspiring, and the knowledge of these practices need not disturb your slumber. Instead, let them accompany you as gentle companions in the transition from awareness to rest, reinforcing the calm, slow rhythm of history for sleep. With this final reflection, the ancient world recedes, leaving only the soft glow of understanding and the peaceful realization that even in secrecy, daily life was guided by structure, care, and human resilience. Your evening now folds into rest, carrying with it the faint imprint of long-ago endurance, a gentle meditation on time, continuity, and the quiet power of human routine.